Hello, cosmic beings out there. I'm Mannah, a therapeutic astrologer and interviewer. I'm passionate about learning and sharing insights on how to live a better life. I hope you'll stick around as I infiltrate the minds of thought leaders, authors, and healers from around the globe. Wherever you find yourself right now, dear listener, I want you to remember that you have a place to call whole. Now, please enjoy this episode. Hi, everyone. So glad you're here today. And I'm really excited because today we're talking to Dr. Michael Smith, someone who's an amazing teacher, a TCM doctor as well, and a podcaster. That's how I discovered you. Welcome, Michael Smith.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
So I was just going to list up things that I know about you, and I'm probably going to need your help here because when I read your bio on your website, and I really appreciate the way that you write on your website, including your bio. I just want to give you that because in these days, it's everything has to be a certain way on the internet, I feel, and just sometimes finding a website where it seems to flow more from the heart or from your imaginative spirit. It feels really good to me. But anyway, it starts at the age of 10. That's how you were introduced to, I think, qigong and maybe some martial arts. And then, I mean, that's a while ago. Then you kind of progressed. I mean, a setback and then progressed again. And how do you introduce yourself with all of that bio?
Well, usually I guess the way I'm introduced depends on what I'm going to be talking about. Because if I'm talking about Qigong or Taoist practice or martial arts or Chinese medicine or functional medicine or autism or trauma and addiction therapy, I also work in the bush teaching people wilderness survival and primitive skills sometimes. It's kind of like my summer hobby. So I don't really watch TV, so I have a lot of spare time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then probably you should go with the title regarding the last one before the wilderness one with trauma,
Mhm.
addiction. I think that's probably the topic. I'm definitely curious about how you look at diagnosis from something that I've read on your website. So
Mhm.
I think that's where we're gonna go.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't know. Do you want to introduce your background within trauma and therapy?
Okay. Well, I grew up in a fairly volatile environment, so I won't get into the details, but growing up where the way we experience trust and power and safety, and the freedom to kind of explore yourself, I think that balance is pretty important, for any of us, but especially as our childhood progresses. And growing up in those environments, typically, for myself or for many people, it's like pushing on a spring. So you take any person and you kind of squeeze their innate nature, perhaps their karma, their astrology, we're all here to be and become something. So we're born and we're going to say we're a spring just for this analogy. And then the world around us pushes on us. And some people contract inwards and they hold all the energy of their life, kind of like a grenade that wants to explode. Other people, like a spring, they're always pushing, like the door open or the window open, or they want to get away. And I think everyone in a way wants to get away. It's just how we approach that. Some people just shut down and internalize, and maybe they just hide in their room and reading. I remember spending about a year in high school just sitting in my room reading. So a part of me kind of took things inward and a part of me fought outwards. So it isn't that you have to pick one or the other. It's that it's often a spectrum of situations that make us feel that way, and behave that way and then see ourselves that way. And in Chinese medicine, other forms of trauma therapy that I've been learning over the, I guess, last 30 years or so, there's many different ways we can talk about this in the sense of psychology or chi or spirits or meridians and things like that. But It's been, I guess, my experience as an educator to try and give people something very contemporary, very easy to wrap our minds around, and something that we can empathize with or identify with in ourselves or other people. Because then the terminology isn't the thing that we're trying to learn. It's the relationship with the experience that we're trying to actually hold or behold in others or accept in some way. So that's not very scientific or doesn't have a lot of fancy, ideas around it yet. But that's where I would usually start with people is given my experience in my life as a clinician for a few decades, it's just checking the spring and this is going to sound funny, but um, s- just taking the analogy of a metal spring one step farther, because I do a lot of work with hunting and wilderness things, when you pick up a good knife, you can tap it and you can kind of hear what kind of steel is in there, right? So it's like there's really bad knives from China or other parts of the world where they just I think they just use old cigarette wrappers or something to make the knives out of anyway. So you can kind of tap that and hear it. And I think maybe there's other things that are like that. So when I meet people, it's kind of like that thing of there's a word in Chinese, 得气, which means to assess. And the old character means to actually assess a melon or a squash if you're at a market. So imagine it's 2,000 years ago and you're at a market looking for your supper. Nowadays, I would encourage people to think of an avocado because if you have access to avocados, you know what it's like to do that thing where you're like, oh, how's that avocado? So that's basically my job is to kind of knock on the door of people's experience and check their avocado for how much compression that they hold and how much explosion that they hold with respect to distress, trauma, life, the oppression of well, a lot of the rules we live with. The agitation of scrolling winds us up in a way. Lack of proper sleep. I mean, most of us need 4 hours a day of silence to be healthy, and that's not happening. So lots of things are happening to our springs or the yin and yang qualities of our being.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. I can't help to think about astrology as you speak, and very evident in the last part about the knife, and well, you being also like a survival. I don't know what is it called when you go out in the wilderness and teach other people to do that as well.
Yeah, I grew up in a hunting lodge between two native reservations. That's a part of my cultural and ancestral background. So, yeah, we had no TV, no radio. We were hunting, trapping, tracking, fishing, living in the middle of nowhere, riding horses, hunting for food.
Perfect. It's perfect for the Aries. You're both the
Oh,
Aries
right.
and
I was just saying that's where I learned all that stuff.
yeah, it's but it's really good for who you are in astrology
Mhm.
as well, and I can't help to think about that. You gave me two birth times. That's really annoying. Two very different birth times.
I have to call my mom and ask her.
Yeah, I think you should do that because now, as you were speaking just before, with where you were talking about the way that you grew up and the way that you cope with it by reading, I was like thinking, oh, maybe it's the other birth time than the one that I thought about, because then there would be more third house activity. Anyway, that's what's just also going on inside of me. Just so you know. Um, but you do say also on your website that you've focused recently on helping people with autoimmune diseases, PTSD, and addiction.
Mhm.
So I want to get into that. But first, I actually want to ask you about something I heard on your podcast, and it's called Primordial Tao, Present Tao
Mhm.
podcast. Just want to give that to the listeners. Great recommendation. Something you say is you talk about knowledge versus awareness, and
Mhm.
that something, if you only knowledge, then something can make sense now, and then 5 minutes later something else makes sense, and that knowledge doesn't really help healing, as I'm hearing it, doesn't really help our insecurity, I think is how you say it. So how can we today, as we talk, make sure that we open up for the awareness factor, if you will, and not just talk from knowledge?
That's a really beautiful and very big question. So I'll do my best to keep the answer within 3 or 4 days. So in First Nations, Native American, Aboriginal culture, there's a very important distinction between knowledge, experience, awareness, and wisdom. Right. So knowledge is, I think, something we can all agree, especially now that we have books and writing and the internet. Knowledge is just something that you can remember. Like Tuesday is the best day to get a good, I don't know, sandwich at your favorite shop or something because your friend works there. I don't know. So
This
something that's very predictable, it's something you can remember, right? So experience is something you can also learn from and remember. But you don't remember it as information. You remember it as how to, right? So you could say, I mean, I hope it's okay to bring up, say, an analogy like sexuality, but we could all watch people have sex, and whether or not that's a good idea, we could talk about another time, maybe. But then we have a sense, or maybe like I grew up around a lot of animals, so maybe I'm watching animals and I'm going, oh, okay, well, that seems to be, where sex goes. So you could say that's the knowledge part. And then as we gain more experience, then we kind of get a sense of what we like and what we don't, and kind of what, produces the kind of outcomes that we're looking for. Awareness, you could say in any context, but I'm just going to use sexuality because that catches people's attention. Awareness is the space between the doing. It's the opportunity to not only feel, but gain the experience from feeling. And you can usually tell when you're, having that kind of an experience with someone, if they're actually allowing the experience and the sensations or whatever's happening to be in the openness of awareness, or if you can see them kind of getting to where they want as fast as they can, and that happens at different parts in the sense of sex. And you could say that some people are more masculine or testosterone driven, both men and women, in the sense of where they get to and how fast they want to get there, and whether or not a person wants to spend more time. And again, we could be talking about learning to play the guitar or sex or how to, I don't know, carve stones or something. But it's that space and awareness that allows us to actually take a moment and receive and reflect and associate. And it's that kind of back and forth, left and right part of the mind, the left brain, right brain, the kind of processing and then associating that actually gives us this other capacity, which is to see what likely will happen um, in a larger amount of time. And we consider that to be something we call wisdom. So wisdom is I know because I know that experience is like in the sense of I know, say, how to make a good soup or how to have sex in a way, but without the experience and then the awareness as a part of the experience and deciding to make sure your awareness goes both towards what else could be understood or learned or felt here, and we have to wait and associate, and then we gain a kind of wisdom, not just about the experience, because I mean, and I choose sex on purpose because when I bring up the idea of wisdom, most people's heads goes like this when they think about sexuality and wisdom, because what does wisdom have to do with that? And if you take a moment, and I can see from the way your face is changing, you're going, oh, wait a minute. There is a wisdom to this, but we don't naturally, consider that in that way. But as perhaps, we get farther along in life and we're not on an escapade or we're not impatient. And we recognize this is going to be perhaps a cornerstone of our intimacy and a certain deep regulation and co-regulation with our partner. And there's many ways to live, but the wisdom of that is to ensure, just like you would keep the right kind of spices in your cabinet if you like to cook a certain kind of food, there's a wisdom to always maintaining a quality, an attention, a patience, a willingness, a back and forth, a sharing. So every part of life has its own experience, its own knowledge, it asks its own awareness, it has its own kind of consequences. And when we really choose to kind of paddle along, in a very conscious way, we gain wisdom. Now, I'm not going to do this, but just imagine, if you will, we just had the same conversation, but we were talking about tactical violence, which is a big part of my other job. Well, I have a few jobs, but training professionals, law enforcement, prison guards, or corrections officers, military, paramilitary people, and how to deal with violence, weapons, knives, and that kind of thing. It's in a way the same thing, because we could say, well, there's the knowledge, but then there's the experience, and then there's awareness, and awareness is a scary thing in that environment. And then there's the wisdom of maybe just never get into those kind of situations in the first place. So you could say with combat, you want to go away from the possibility of getting more experience, whereas sexuality, you might want to go
Yeah,
towards. Wisdom looks different, right, in different situations.
yeah. Oh, but certainly wisdom should be very essential for working with violence. Yeah, like self-defense, I guess, is part of that, and not hurting too much, not hurting people more than necessarily, or something like that.
If you've got 20 or 30 years, that's possible. If and I'm sorry
That
to say
okay.
this
Yeah.
bluntly as I will, but
I was like
uh,
thinking 20 or 30 years in prison for violence, but
well, I mean that it could go that way too, I guess. But
that way. But you were talking about that it takes a while to learn that. Yeah,
mhm,
yeah, I see. Okay. Oh, there's a lot of good stuff in there. I also think that just the way that you speak is inviting wisdom, because you use a lot of metaphors just in the way that you naturally express yourself. So that's pretty
mhm,
good. So but just because I wanted to set an intention here in our conversation, because I definitely don't want to. That's like I want to hold myself to that standard of well, being present, but also what we are talking about, that it has to do with the heart. It has to do with something. I'm trying not to say something about like applying it practically, because not it doesn't always have like an exact outcome from when we are talking about something big, and it doesn't, then you can use it in this exact moment. So it's not, maybe not practical, I mean, but just something. So,
could we change one word
yeah, please.
instead of practical? How about practicable?
Yeah. Yeah, what do you mean? Practicable.
Well, excuse me. I think practical puts us in the mind of anticipation, in the sense of I now have a tool that I can practically use to adjust and kind of control and maintain or manufacture a kind of outcome, which you could say is probably the least romantic, or the least sort of good smelling, delightful thing,
Yeah.
because it's just like, oh, I have a wrench and a problem, and bonk, 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 I hope it goes away.
Hmm.
So I think practical, it also makes us feel tired,
Mm.
especially if a person's been through a certain volume of overwhelm in their life. So when you say, oh, I've got a practical thing, they're like, I don't want a practical thing. You say, how about something you could practice that actually gives you energy? So practice something that actually, maybe, say, a lot of us have a lot of time, spend a lot of time kind of figuring out our boundaries. And if we think of that boundary like the shield in a spaceship in a fancy movie or something, how much energy does it take every day to hold that shield up, be aware of that shield, maintain that distance, watch the horizon for the people who might actually come and try and get past that shield, and then prepare in your mind all of the stuff that could go wrong if the wrong people, blah, blah, blah. We're having an anxiety attack now, right? But if I can actually go, what would it be like to maybe have less of a concern about how many and how bad what's outside my shield is, and just focus on what it feels like to, with a certain amount of innocence, just care for my well-being. We all are probably aware, if we're prone to anxiety, that it's about 80% of the time we actually think someone is actually going to harm us or insult us or challenge us or overwhelm us in some way. And they're actually just there to see if we're okay, offer us, something to eat, maybe, want to go for a walk. So as we start recognizing, it's actually only 20% of the time that shield, that boundary actually needs to be strong,
Mm.
then I can start to soften and keep that energy for my own well-being, my own interests, my own deep breathing, my own sense of sanctity or autonomy. And then I can also decide with that sense of a boundary or a shield, because we don't want to get tired again, that I can have this practice of just being aware of what it's like to hold myself in that, again, sense of autonomy, but also hold the reason why I feel anxious in a way.
Mm.
Right. So, okay, I've had bad experiences. I just quit drinking after 20 years, or I just got out of a divorce, or I just started a new relationship and I don't trust people very well. There's so many ways in which we can actually care for our state, care for our sense of being wounded, which doesn't take a lot of energy. It just takes a moment of like holding onto a friend, which kind of gives us energy because we're in that communal state. And then being aware of, let me, before I have antennas now instead of a shield, let me sense who is my friend and who I might want to just be a little bit more blunt or stoic or at a distance with. And now I'm caring for my energy and for the woundedness I may feel. And now I'm noticing the woundedness in the people coming towards me who I want to hug, and then woundedness in the people who come towards me that I don't want to have anything to do with because they're not okay right now. I don't want to judge them. I don't want to, throw things at them, but I don't want them to hurt me either. And they're attracted to me because we have this annoying thing like trauma bonding. We always attract the people we need, but we also attract the people we need to learn why we're still reacting to these kind of people. So good job, universe. But when we learn a little bit of efficiency in or awareness or practice, then the world comes back to a kind of warmth. It's like a sunrise kind of feeling. We call it in Chinese shenming. It's kind of a radiance of spirit because it's like I'm allowed to learn. I'm allowed to participate. I'm allowed to practice. And no, the world is not out to get me and crush me. Right? Maybe someone in a very unconscious moment has, imposed that on us at times, but that's not the universe. That's people who need help. And they don't realize that they're acting out badly. And that's true of many parents. I mean, it's very new in the world, especially from traditional cultures that were raised by our parents instead of being raised by our grandparents. We're three generations into being raised by people who've never been raised by people who know how to raise people. It's a bit chaotic.
Do you sometimes do you sometimes feel like that you are a little beyond other people in the way that you perceive things? just from the I'm trying to take in what you're saying, and you're taking me. Yeah, it's you're taking me far. But I'm
That's my
thinking,
job.
sorry.
So that's my job.
That's your job. Yes, it is. And I love it. All right. So, could we go through maybe a few diagnoses and hear your take on it? Because you have this amazing quote on your website that where you're saying it could be valuable to discuss diagnosable psychiatric conditions like they are case studies, and sometimes it's also valuable to diagnose the researchers, the clinicians, and the writers of the DSM
Mhm.
and their perspective on human health. So, um, yeah, I don't know. Do you want to start with just commenting on what you mean about diagnosing the people who's actually classifying our mental health into categories?
Um, yeah. So, um, I think it's important to take a step back sometimes and be really objective about how we as human beings got where we are. Um, and maybe I'll just say that um, as I became more committed to teaching clinicians and doing a lot more research, and then we decided to include what's called the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychiatric Conditions, big book. In the teaching that we were doing for Chinese medicine and psychology and psychiatry, just because we wanted to, at that point in Canada, Chinese medicine was becoming licensed. So we wanted to be able to communicate very one-to-one with people who work in hospitals, people who work in all of different parts of medicine. So that just seemed like a good idea. And as we started going through that process, it occurred to me that there was something about the way Western medicine approaches taking care of people that didn't feel quite right. And I'll give you an example. When you study any condition, you're going to find all the papers and journals and etc. that, look at the research. And almost always in medical articles, the second paragraph is about the number of what's called man hours are lost to industry. So presently in 2024, clinical depression is the most diagnosed and I would say mistreated condition in the world on planet Earth. And the reason that that's such a concern for Western industrial society is depressed people don't work very much, very hard, or very consistently. So again, when we look at the Western psychiatric model, it's really about who can participate in the industrial process and who needs to be put in a hospital or given some kind of medicine and asked to stay at home or just stay in their basement playing video games because you're not well enough to participate in the machinery of industry and efficiency. And that's been something that's been, I hope I can say this, pissing me off for about 35 years. Since I initially got into medicine, which is why are we talking about the care and the reason why people are clinically depressed, let's say, and all of the things that we could do for them, all of the things that we could do to make our world less likely to wear people down in that specific way. But Western society says, you know what we're going to do? We're going to have a scale of how less valuable these people are in the context of efficiency in industry and outcome. So we could say that we have just become a left brain in the sense that we're not concerned with what life is like. We're concerned with what life is for,
Mm.
which in the industrial context is keep the economy going, keep industry going, keep food, keep metals, keep animals, keep everything just becoming what we want it to become to keep everything moving. And obviously that's always been true for all animals, all human life. It's just throughout most of human cultural history, we also took care of the average well-being of most of the people. There's always going to be a small percentage of people that are just sort of beyond our care. And in early traditional societies, we eventually, unfortunately, had to shun or banish people if they just couldn't collaborate with respect to the safety of the rest of us. But now we just have this almost like running, or I guess I would think of a train on tracks moving at a speed that if you can't keep up with the train, well, sorry, we're going to throw you off the train. And we're going to maybe wrap that decision up in a bundle with a label like depression or anxiety or borderline personality disorder or we don't like the way you smell in the sense of a certain tendency around schizophrenia or other things. So I would just say sometimes it's nice to take a step back and if I was to clarify that into a sentence, industrial colonization and the domestication of human beings is not healthy. So that's when you look at the authors of the DSM, they're doing their best to organize what's going wrong with some people, but they're not really that interested in the well-being of society.
I know I keep thinking about your astrology. I'm trying to tell my mind to put it away, but it keeps coming up. Just one last piece about your astrology, right? And
Sure.
I think it can also be the Pisces, um, because you have Mercury in Pisces and a few other planets there. I'm not really looking at houses because I don't have the birth time correct. I think it could be that because Pisces is about wholeness. I'm a Pisces sun and I have this slogan of a place to call whole. It's about wholeness. And so it means you can be skilled at many different things and interested in many different things on a practical level. That could be what it means, but also that you're open energetically. And so when your Mercury is in Pisces, mine is not, for example, but yours is. So Mercury is like you probably know is the way that you would in a way translate the world. And it also has to do with what you're just talking about now in terms of working. in Pisces, because it's such a passive quality and so such a spiritual, surrendered archetype. It makes really good sense that two things. What I started to actually comment on is the way that you connect knowledge and the way that you go out on, you have different associations, and it's really lovely to listen to. It's, I hope you take it as a compliment, because I mean it, and I know you from the podcast, you do the same, and I really just take it in. There's a lot in when you say something, um even like symbolic meanings and, yeah, different topics all at once. So that's the one thing with the Pisces. And then also with what you're just talking about now, with the whole, like, am I only worthy as a human being, if I can work, right? What about the more passive quality of just being worthy for who I am? And
or art, or spiritual practice, or I always think about I see this thing come up on social media a lot about 1 million children in Thailand meditating on world peace.
oh,
I mean, why don't we have like 10% of the population given a check every month to just pray for peace?
yeah.
I mean, I don't mean that literally. I just mean in the sense of how industrial we are instead of how curious we are.
I think it's a good idea, literally as well. I mean, that's, because that would be really honoring a spiritual practice and really considering it as something that works and is.
Yeah, and there's actually, they did research in 2004 in New York City, or no, it was Washington, D.C., the place in the United States that's kind of got its own country or something. They brought 400 people there who were skilled meditators, for 4 days, and they all went to hotels or parks or back alleys or different places in Washington, D.C., the most violent city in the world. And for 4 days, they all just moved there and meditated on peace. And I'm not making this up. The violent crime rate within about 100 miles dropped 25% for 4 days.
Wow.
And all these people were doing was just holding space for peace.
And I did hear you earlier saying that we all need 4 hours of peace a day. Did you say that?
Well, if you're focused on, say, Qigong, yoga, meditation, shamanic practice, if you do any kind of significant energy work, that's a vague thing to say, but that takes a lot of uh, movement with respect to your meridians and deeper aspects of what it is that makes our bodies work, even inside the brain, which if you want to read about that stuff, I have a Substack that sometimes goes into like brain chemistry and stuff. There's a part of the brain we call the hippocampus, and it has a lot of really important jobs. But when we get into meditation and we take that perhaps thoroughly, I don't want to say seriously, but thoroughly, it turns out to be a medical fact, a neurological fact, that after 4 hours of silence, not just sleeping, but actually being awake but silent, the hippocampus can grow back, like to actually regenerate itself. And if you're on chronic distress, PTSD, many other things, that part of the brain actually shrinks and it can't work properly. And how we form and how we place memories as urgent memories, long-term memories, happy memories, that all changes, and it changes many other structures in the brain. The reason I bring this up in the sense of very unexpected connections that empower us and sometimes surprise us, which is one of my favorite things to do. It turns out that almost every significant, serious, long-term, thousands of years old meditation tradition says if you actually want to proceed with what meditation is for, you need to orient your body for a period of time until you're prepared physically, somatically for practice. And then you need to sit perfectly still in silence for 4 hours to begin what meditation is for. It takes 4 hours for the hippocampus to regenerate enough that you have your whole brain in meditation.
Just like one time sitting for 4 hours, or every day?
Well, I'd say probably once a week would be a good thing to do. And here's an example of something that I think is delightful to consider. If you keep waking up in the middle of the night, it might be because your brain is starving for silence.
Ah, ah,
Because if you don't get enough silence, a part of your brain that makes you you gets smaller and smaller. And I often think of this as like a grape, like the fruit, a grape, or a raisin, which is a dried up, withered grape. So do you want to have a raisin or a grape? Especially when you're relying on the facility of your neurophysiology, the actual volume or the Qing of your brain in the Chinese medicine sense, to anchor your shen or your spirit in the coherence of meditation. And it's an interesting modern presumption that you can be addled and anxious and on four different chemicals and still have a thorough meditation practice, given that your brain isn't actually physiologically a grape, it's a raisin.
mm,
Your spirit can't anchor itself in a raisin very well if it's meant to be a grape, right? So we already pick a bit of pictures, and I'm not suggesting meditation's of no value if you're not doing it longer.
mm.
I'm just saying these traditions that go back thousands of years, it's there's an entry point into something that's only possible when the structures of your brain are happy and healthy. And
Yeah.
and I would encourage anyone with those kinds of practices to just put that on the thing to do next time you have a few days to be alone and quiet, or if you're going to go to a retreat or anything like that, just to see what it's like to make sure, oh yeah, this is me with my whole brain in the yin and yang balance of coherent being. And then you can begin, like really begin.
This is so important. And in the beginning, where you were introducing yourself and what should the tradition you come from, you were talking about, as I heard it, translating it into contemporary trauma therapy kind of terminology, and that's what I feel, because I still study trauma therapy. I think I'm going to do that for a long time because there's so much to study.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I think it's really so coherent with it. It goes very well with qigong tradition, Taoism, and the pieces that I hear from there. It's uh, it's really not it's not opposites. It's not different in a way. So I feel like the newer trauma therapies are really based on that ancient knowledge that you're talking about.
Mhm.
And so if we could go through a few diagnoses together, PTSD, for example, that you've worked a lot with. How do you see it? What is the diagnosis in Chinese medicine, the traditional Chinese medicine, and what do you do about it? I think you maybe have said some about it already with the silence, but just if you actually have PTSD, then what?
So this is going to take a minute to kind of put in place. Um, when we think of the idea of a diagnosis, especially in the Western context, we have what you might call little t trauma, and we have capital T, big T trauma in the sense of here's a term, and underneath of the umbrella of that term, here's all of these people, here's the range of experiences, capacities, and limits that they have. Because that's kind of what a diagnosis, especially a psychiatric diagnosis, is for, is capacity and limits and need for care and or medication and things like that. So the label is helpful in the sense of like a big conveyor belt of moving people through hospitals and things like that. When we look at earlier traditions like Chinese medicine and trauma, the characters for the skill set in Chinese medicine for helping people are called qing chirping. And Chinese is a very old language. So the terms qing chirping mean affective, emotional, or feeling is what qing means. Zhi kind of means your willpower, your willingness, or how you orient yourself, how you move through the world. And bing means kind of a wound or an illness. Interestingly enough, that can mean the effects of trauma, emotionally disorienting wounds,
Ah,
right? But that in Chinese, because it's contextual language, when we say qingzhibing, we mean both what it's like to be wounded by trauma and also the people who take care of the people who've been wounded by trauma. Because I practice qingzhibing, I could be diagnosed with qingzhibing. I diagnose with that all people with that all of the time. So it's a context of human beingness. Because if your way of your way of feeling into the world, what's that feel like to be you? That's very subjective, but it can be qualified in the sense of, you're a relatively angry person, you're a relatively passive person, you're too helpful, you're not helpful enough, or whatever the things could be that kind of help us understand your state of being, the way you actually feel, because that's the first thing people notice about you. Nowadays, I think we call it a person's vibe, your
Yeah,
affect. A person walks into the room and we're all like, hey, or we're like, oh. So, people walk into the room and we're like, okay, Ching, that's the thing you kind of bring into the room in the sense of feeling. Sure, is more your story, your why you do the things you do, why you will never do that again, why you're going to finally go and have that experience, why it's all about money, or it's all about art, or it's all about music, or, it's all about sitting on the top of a volcano for 4 hours in silence, or whatever it could be. So we all have our state and we all have our story that gives us like a compass dial. This is the way I want to go, or this is the way I never want to go again. But as long as it directs your choices, that's your sure, right? In a way, there's a kind of warriorship to that because we're certain, whether or not that's true or not, but we're certain that this is the thing we need to do for some reason, positive or to avoid the negative. And then Bing can mean, again, woundedness, illness, a kind of scar, right? And there's a beauty to the scars we carry. One of my favorite quotes is, the scars we have are the tapestry of our soul, right? So when you meet a person in that somewhat poetic sense is, as a doctor, when people come into the office, the first thing I feel is their affect, their vibe, the way they actually, you can almost imitate them as a comedian, right? And this is a thing we're taught to do in acupuncture, because if you can imitate a person, the way they walk, and you feel in your body where you'd want the acupuncture to open your meridians, you already know what to do. You don't need a diagnosis. You have human empathy, what's called neuroception. You could kind of like intuitively feel what it's like to be them in state when they
that's
sit
a
down.
it's a helpful thing to do as a therapist sometimes as well. If there's a client you don't really understand,
Mhm.
to ask them, is it okay that I try to do what you're doing? And then you imitate the body language and everything. And then
Yeah,
you
yeah.
oh, now I get this sense. Is that what you're feeling? Then you can test it out like that. So yeah, just
Yeah,
recognize.
Western medicine would actually think you're mentally ill if you wanted to do that. In the sense of how to diagnose people. Anyway, enough about those guys. So when then you sit down, you start talking to someone and you ask them about, well, what's been going on? What have you been through? Right? And as they talk about what they've been through, you can see what it's like for them, what it was like for them, and what it is like for them now. And an interesting thing, and this could be a whole podcast itself, maybe I will someday. Early languages like Chinese, I'm familiar with three Aboriginal languages. Most of the words don't mean information. Most of the words talk about what it was like in that relating, what it was like in that experience, what it was like in that verb-like quality. Ancient languages have mostly verbs, very few nouns. So the way that you communicate is trying to share what it was like in your way of relating to life, because that's what you're communicating is changes in relating, changes in experience, changes in understanding, and what it's like to keep going and growing. In English, words are things, and things have value and comparison and interest in a way. So it's sometimes tricky to translate things back and forth. So I just wanted to bring that up because when you're sitting in a chair in a room with a patient, they come in, you get a sense of affect, they talk about their experience, you get a sense of what it was like for them. I'm not interested in diagnosing them. I'm interested in empathizing what it's been like for them and how they think about the world. And I often ask people like, well, what do you do for your living? What are your hobbies? Because a lot of what we do is in analogy and metaphor. Because if you exist in a language that's all about what things are like, metaphor gives you an umbrella to try and help people identify with and reflect on what their life is like. So that's why I speak metaphorically a lot, or I try and use imagery a lot, because then we can all share, yeah, I understand what that's like. We can share an understanding, a quality, instead of, yes, I understand Fred has, one leg is too short, so he limps a lot, right? So we can be very reductionist, or we can be very what's called inductive, which is to actually connect with as many things as we can and appreciate how it means something. Because you don't treat people for their problems, you help people change what's meaningful. Because we all orientate to meaning,
Yeah.
right? So this is the kind of process, and the wound, you could say, in the sense of Qing or Bing, the wound is the volume of distress and how guarded or how thick their boundaries are, or how fragile, you could say, the shell of their egg or their boundary is. Because then you have a sense of pace and also a sense of care. Because this person's symptoms might be the proverbial straw on a camel's back that's also on an elephant, that's also on a piano. Like some people are just barely one conversation away from like going on a bender or perhaps harming themselves in some way. So other people are very strong and they want to they want to build trust through contention, not violence, hopefully in a clinic, but through a kind of argumentation. And then you could say that's almost like the Greek Stoics would sit down and have these, 4-hour debates or 10-hour debates about things that can get very, very like almost like, a court battle on a, in the sense of fighting with reason. So it really depends so much on are you are you trying to help the person with cognition? Are you trying to help them with feeling? Are you trying to help them with aspects of somatic awareness and self or multiple selves? Because that's actually what you're interacting with is their adaptive capacity and the way they understand themselves, and they understand what's wrong in the sense of a diagnosis. So yeah, we don't really diagnose people. We just try and figure out the best tool set to actually have a good, meaningful conversation and the most accurate place for the acupuncture needles or herbs if we're treating them symptomatically or system for the kind of systems in Chinese medicine.
But you call it PTSD and you operate with these diagnoses, but in your explanation here, you say you don't even go into that.
Well, I could say I was just framing what the term Qingzhibing means in the sense of understanding
So
the
if someone comes and says has the PTSD symptoms,
Mhm.
you kind of know what that's about. And do you
Yeah.
go a certain way, or do you still do what you were just saying, like
Mhm.
finding what's meaningful and helpful in
Yeah.
that?
So then you have to make a decision. Once you've got a sense of what their affect is like, their Qing, you have a sense of their story, the depth or their adaptive capacity with their woundedness. Now we have two choices, and they kind of happen at the same time. But as a clinician, you kind of have to figure this out as you go. One side is relief care. This person has PTSD. I can describe what that's like energetically in a lot of different ways. And that isn't really the most important part in the sense of which of the ways. Like I can, you can use a lot of different frames of reference, but relief care, is it anxiety? Is it insomnia? Is it physical restlessness? Is it a kind of vexation in the embodied somatic state where a person is just vibrating with a sense of unease or dis-ease? Are they kinesthetically fidgety? Or are they very, very flat? And there's about 30 symptoms that we focus on in psychiatry and pretty much any tradition around the world. It just has to do with making sure the person's as comfortable as they can be and as resourceful as they can be in the sense of good sleep and good food and exercise and everything else we can do to care for their symptomatic well-being, if you will. And that's just compassion in a way, but it's also what most of medicine is, oh, you have insomnia, take this, or you're, dealing with depression and anxiety. Well, these will help you. They will help you in the short term feel more resilient so that you can actually do something perhaps more specific to your adaptive capacity. So you and I have a choice right now. And I want to be clear in one choice I'm going to make. Because one thing you and I could speak to right now would be PTSD and meridians, because that's a really cool thing, and people think there's a takeaway that they can have.
Yeah.
You could talk about PTSD in the kidneys and heart. You could talk about PTSD in the spleen and the liver. You could talk about PTSD in what's called Hun and Po and Shun and Qing and Yi, which are what called the five wills, which congregate or separate or interact negatively as components of consciousness, in a way that we could say, this is what we're going to use to describe what's going on. Now, there's many, many cool, fun ways to do that, but I'd like to try something else instead if you're okay with
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, I'm curious where you're gonna go.
So, what's it like to have PTSD? Because
Mm,
this is a what's it like qualitative understanding. We're not interested in the name. Symptoms we can treat. That's easy. Oh, you don't have very good sleep. Take this. This will help you sleep so we can actually do the work on healing. So people like F words. So I'm going to give you some F words. Fight, flight, freeze, right? Feign, fawn, frustrate. These are 6. There's many others, but here's 6 F words that are aggravated by trauma. Now, let's pick one. Fight, flight, freeze, feign, fawn, frustrate.
fawn. I'm
Fawn?
curious about fawning.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think you are probably the most important person I've ever met. I really, really can't wait to learn more from you. And I feel a little shy and awkward when we get together. But as long as you're the powerful one and you know you're powerful, I'll be safe because you'll want to protect me in some way because I'm looking up to you.
Yeah.
So what happened to me?
Well, it's a trauma response, right? It's a nervous system response. So you're not being you're acting as if there is a threat in my perception. Like I'm not being real with you. I'm still scared around you.
Mhm.
I'm fawning. Isn't can
Yeah,
you
but now I've made you not dangerous to me because I'm fawning to you, which
yeah,
is why I'm playing that out with that acting. I'm not a very good actor, but if I pretend that I'm fawning, at least I'm getting a sense of what it's like. But I'm
yeah,
also realizing my safety place is to be in the shadow of people who are dangerous. And as long as I quiver and cower enough, I will maintain at least less likely violence, less likely conflict, less likely having to take responsibility and the outcome and consequences if I do well or not so well, right? So now I'm basically, think of a dog, a small dog, who's physically vibrating in terror of actually being hurt more by a bigger animal.
yeah.
So that's fawning. We just turn it into, you're so nice and important and big and cool and shiny. And I really, really hope you'll just adopt me so that you'll take care of the world out there. And I'll just hide, like a puppy between my mummy's legs so I don't get hurt. Now, that's a hugely challenging thing to get out of. But you have to start with the qualities of embodiment, the qualities of relating, the sense of self, and why we have chosen, or perhaps subconsciously chosen, or been directed in that way. There's ancestral traumatic reasons or generationally traumatic reasons why we may pendulum back and forth between being the barking dog and the scared dog, and then your child is the barking dog, and now you're the scared dog, and then your grandparents, and it goes generation to generation back and forth. And that's the universe kind of like crashing into the extremes, trying to find the center, in kind of the ways the world, works itself out. But you can pick any aspect of trauma, but instead of saying, oh yeah, PTSD, that isn't really a helpful thing. Clearly, the person is not in their adaptive capacity and they're overwhelmed by the things in their life. Now, that same situation could be a person who's going to fight, right? They have PTSD. I mean, there's a dozen possibilities. I brought up 6. We're going to pick fawning or fighting. Like these are 2 completely different people, same diagnosis, profoundly different generational sort of things in the sense of the yelling, barking dog and the small, timid dog, right? So we want to start getting closer and closer to the sort of the emotional quality, the behavior quality, the relational quality, so we can imitate and understand what it's like, because that's what you're actually treating is the quality of relating, the quality of experience, the quality of a sense of self. And this brings us into a very deep paradigm of practice and therapy that has nothing to do with your diagnosis. It has to do with recognizing as a consciousness, as a spiritual being, you can attend to this whole thing in a completely different way if you actually want to mature spiritually. But that requires a tradition, a practice, a mentor, and time.
Mm, okay. I'll
And
try.
if you're lucky, that mentor will also be able to treat your symptoms for symptom relief so that you can feel well during the period of time it takes for you to heal. And that's how Chinese medicine goes about it.
Absolutely. Um,
So I
okay.
could speak to that if you like.
Oh, this is so tempting, but I have okay. I have two things that are on my wish that I wish for in our time together here. But you tell me if there's something here you feel like you need to share, because
Well, I'll see where you go next. And then if I feel like I really want to go back, I will.
then you can dive into that. It's because we're talking about what it is like. Then I would like to give you just this symbol of a wound in the stomach. A wound in the stomach. That's how I'm currently working with one of my parts, and I'm not actually sure if it's. I'm not sure it's translatable like that, but in my language, you can say like stomach wound, and then that's
Mhm.
diagnosis.
Mhm.
But I also like to think of it symbolically, not only like that illness, but there's something I think profound in that. Of course, I'm talking about different parts of me, right? And this is like a part that's suffering. At times, I feel it in certain situations, and I feel it as a wound in the stomach, and it of course it propels me to care for it, right? I want to listen to it, but I just like that. I'm just symbolically interested, curious about a wound in the stomach. So I'm just wanting to hear, what do you think that is like?
I'm very familiar with what that's like.
Okay.
I could speak to two understandings of how to relate to that. So in the organs and meridian understanding of Chinese medicine, your stomach meridian is a part of the soil or the earth.
Yeah.
All right. So that means your somatic self. That means your felt sense of how soft and playful you are around people as well. So we call that meridian system Yang Ming, which uh, I won't translate that too much, but it has to do with how we actually hold on to each other. It's the only Yang meridian that's on the front of your body. Most of your Yang meridians are protective. They're on the back.
Mm.
So when we track those meridians down, there's parts that come into your hand where you would reach around and actually hold on to something. But there's also the line of your tears that come down your face, down through your nipples, down through the front of your body. So there's this whole aspect of human beings that when we hold on to each other and really connect and bond and open and share and hold each other, and there's research on a good hug will produce oxytocin. That's something to be just connected to as I get into this, because that meridian has to do with trust, affection, bonding, and respect, and your social, it's just sense of being equal or in reciprocity or collaboration with people. So let's just hold that there for a minute. Okay, Chinese medicine says, trust, intimacy, respect, bonding. That's interesting. Over here in more Western classic trauma therapy, we have this thing called neuroception, which is how we learn to read body language, tone of voice, facial expressions, so that we can read whether or not our caregivers care and the faces we need to make them care more and or other things like that. So we have this thing called neuroception. People usually call that your intuition because you can tell a person's being authentic within a few seconds without knowing how you know. So same thing, trust, bonding, intimacy, affection, connection. So if we have this thing in the center of our celiac plexus or solar plexus, And we call it the solar plexus because it goes up and down like the sun in the sense of where the nerves go. The upper part is the social connection communication part. And this is in animals. Like we're human beings or animals, believe it or not. So we have this need to actively interact socially to make sure bonding and trust is and collaboration is possible. But down here below the diaphragm is all the instinctual stuff that's connected to your adrenal glands, fight or flight, and whether or not you just pee your pants if you're scared, right? So right back here at the root of your diaphragm is what we call the butterflies in your stomach, which is the stress place when we feel anxious because we don't have a lot of experience of trusting, bonding, and connecting to people, sharing intimacy and respect back and forth in a way that we don't feel alone. We don't feel too alone or too likely that there's going to be conflict or judgment or shaming kind of experience. That's like an alarm dashboard light. If you have a car, you're driving along, it says, warning, any more of this and something's going to break. Something in my soul might get hurt, right? So we have those two ways of looking at it. What it's like to as a person is the same. How we talk to people about what it's like might depend if they want to think about it more behaviorally, uh, how they might want to go into conscious communication practices, sitting in circles, working with conscious communication to restore that neuroceptive communication and the experience of having people you can trust and open to. And then over here in Chinese medicine, there's all kinds of things you can do with Qigong, with breath work, with meridians, with acupuncture, with herbs to help with that as well, right? Because we're just working with what it's like. And these could be construed as literally physical parts of your anatomy, and one kind of is, but they're more about functions that we need and functions that we can assess and we can improve and we can, learn to help ourselves and each other with, you know.
That's really good. I actually do see a acupuncturist about every other week or so for the earth element that I'm aware connected to that. But that's really interesting, all of what you just said, and also so would you say that one of the healing remedies would then be community? Would you say that to a client, or would you, I don't know, what would you do when someone comes with that? Because I also like the way that you think of things symbolically, and you're saying this is what it's like, and then you have all of these things that you know, and it's of course obviously also an embodied practice. But do you see any symbolism in it? I don't know. I'm just asking here.
Well, I mean, we could play with that, but when we look at PTSD, which I think is something we all have a relationship with in the sense that we've been through things, we have what are called the classic wounds of trauma. One of the first classic wounds of trauma is I've been hurt. I want to become more hypervigilant to the next thing that might hurt me. Right? And as I get more and more anxious, more and more nervous, I might start using food or alcohol or cannabis or I don't know, anything else. I could be misusing people, sex, gambling, just because I need to compensate for the fact that feeling like I'm always hypervigilant is making me tired or nervous or anxious or depressed or just doesn't, feel right in some way. And as that gets more and more consistent, our behavior changes. Now we want to spend all of our time at home, maybe just drinking and smoking pot and playing video games, which, is a pretty common thing. For some people, now I'm becoming socially disoriented, right? Now I actually have a story for all of my friends, if I still have friends, and my family, if my family still holds me in care, that I'm just going through this thing. So now I have to have a story and an explanation for my sense of connection because I don't really care about connecting to people anymore. I care about soothing my pain,
Yeah.
right? So as that becomes a bit of a precipice, I actually start to anyone in that situation starts to lose a sense of trust in people and connection and relating and communication as a place of solace, because that maybe is where the trauma started, or my attempt to communicate, I chose the wrong people, sometimes that's how it starts. And those people shamed me and shunned me. So now I don't feel like I even deserve another chance to heal. So now I'm just gonna, sort of find a hole to hide in some way. And at a certain point, the pain of that, the aloneness of that, often we're pretty deep in addiction at that point. I'm now just in existential pain. But all of this is about a loss of trust. And the stomach is all about trust, bonding, affection, intimacy, and all of that, right? So as we start losing trust, the pain of that becomes the wound. And that's where PTSD is what I would call an explicit diagnosis, is the person's life is centered around compensating for existential pain. Right? Because now there's really not a lot of adaptive capacity except I need to get through my pain. Today is just to stay at home today. Today is to go to work drunk day. Today is go to work sober and pretend that I'm not banging my head into the corner of a sharp object inside my mind just to get through my day. Because pain is sometimes a way we soothe pain in the brain. Right? So we build up a certain volume of distress to trigger a pain relieving mechanism in the brain. And this is where dysfunctional relationship patterns, workaholism, other stuff happens because we just keep burning ourselves out to get some brain chemicals that are like endorphins and morphine or opiates.
Mm. So what you were just saying there a moment ago is that PTSD, you look at that as compensation for existential pain.
At a certain threshold, that's when a person's in crisis most of the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Then when you have PTSD, then that's the coping mechanism, or that's you've lost that adaptive function, is what you said. And then
Well, can we change one thing?
yes, please.
So when we say someone has PTSD, that's like saying someone has herpes,
Yeah, okay.
right? So we all have the capacity in our adaptive capacity to be worn down to the point where someone would say, oh my God, you're in existential pain, or you're well along the way of PTSD. But to say a person has it or doesn't have it puts our mind in the sense of black and white instead of a spectrum of adaptive capacity, volume of distress, character, nature, upbringing, all of the things that make every individual human uniquely individual. So the diagnosis for me, and this is a Chinese medicine thing around Western medicine, if a person comes in with a diagnosis, that would fall under a complex of symptoms. So what are the symptoms of that diagnosis? I'll just check those off and investigate them more precisely. But the label is distracting. I've been diagnosed with Crohn's disease.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean? Some guy in the 1930s cut people's intestines up and looked at it under a microscope and said, hey, look at this bad thing that's happening, right? And now we have that name. So diagnostic labels have an abstract word and then a volume of distress that comes with them because, oh my God, tick, 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 at some point in time, it's going to kill me. Cancer is like being haunted with a label. So I tend to try and,
That's even also pathologizing. Even the label
yeah,
is more.
yeah. So that's often the first thing sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just saying, because it also makes me feel like I'm separate from other people and maybe weaker than other people, and all of
Mhm.
these judgments about myself, right? That could come as an effect of a diagnosis. That's just my thinking.
So one of the things we try and do is actually help people deconstruct the harm that's projected onto them or that they project onto themselves with the label of a diagnosis. And then we go again back into affect and state, story and orientation, whether or not they're really bounded up in boundary or they're very fragile in their boundedness, because this is about a practice, right? So Qingdruping is a practice, like Qigong or yoga or meditation is a practice. So when we meet people, the thing we want to assess basically is how much symptom relief do we need to focus on as the person builds resilience and adaptive capacity to build the skill set to actually heal themselves. So I'll offer you a very quick model for this, and there's a lot to this, but I'm just going to ask you a strange question. if you can look at yourself, you know, your personality, your history, your best days and worst days, the way you probably would respond to, say you're driving down the road and you see a car accident, it's yourself that's going to respond to that car accident. So do you have a sense of self-awareness, you know, in the sense of who you are and all of that?
Yeah, mostly feeling fearful around what you just said.
Right? So here we are looking at ourself. Now I'm going to play a little logic game here, but if you can hold yourself in consideration, like holding, you know, say a cat in your hand, you must be something bigger than a self to be aware of a self. And that's what we would call your sinshan, your mind and heart, right? So your mind is something you can train. And we have many selves and many minds and many souls and spirits in Chinese medicine that are considered sort of symbolic components of being a human being. But if we can first take a moment and go, I have a cat, I have a self, I'm aware of my cat or myself. How do I take care of myself?
Is there a meaning to the analogy of cats? Because I'm really fearful of cats.
Uh, let's make it a dog or an almost finished pot of soup that you're just going to finish the last little bits of flavor with.
Great,
Think
great.
of something that you want. Like if you have a favorite recipe, think of it as a favorite recipe, but it doesn't taste right because you're going through a hard time. So how do we help ourselves? We become aware of ourselves. We become aware that we're not ourself. Ourself is something that we have as a social construct. If you ever, I've done many hermit retreats where I'm gone for long periods of time in meditation. I don't want to come back because if I come back, then I need a self again. Oh man, where's my cat? Where's that bowl of soup? I have to walk around with this thing to make sure everyone make sure I taste okay. Because how do you think of my cat? Oh, you're afraid of cats. Oh no. But the point of it is if we can accept the truth that yourself is sort of a hologram, a resume, a story, a hopefully acceptable date at the prom,
Yeah.
that's not really you. It's the social thing that we need to work with to become socially collaborative and perhaps potent enough to be held within our community as a person of consequence. Because we all seek that. We're all tribal people. You go back, I don't know, 50,000 years, we're all hunter-gatherers working our best together uh, to share the resources and find more resources, right? Pretty simple. So if we go to modern life and in the context of mental and emotional well-being, step one is maybe we can work on ourselves in any number of ways and in multiple different kind of paradigms and contexts, which is what's beautiful about Chinese medicine, because you have multiple toolkits to play with. But how do you train mind? How do you train heart? What is spirit? Is spirit like Casper the Ghost in the cartoon movies, or is spirit something that's about just the way we are in life? And then what's behind spirit? And in Chinese medicine, we have these ideas of souls, and we can take that literally the way we take everything literally in English, or we can ask ourselves, well, what is that like? Because it's really about what it's like in those languages. It's not about them being literally true, because those languages are non-literal. They're inherently shamanic. They're still coming from times in human civilization where we didn't know any better than the wind seems to be in charge of the weather and the wind must be God. So let's just pray to the wind. You know, so when we can reorient ourselves back to what practices can I put in place to be more mindful, more mind coherent, more mind spacious. Maybe that 4 hours of silence to actually have a functioning brain, you know, in the sense of what it's like to be super grounded in the way we think about our feelings. And now that we have that ability to be consistent and patient around our thoughts and feelings, now we can feel deeply into our feelings and not be in urgent need to control them or anxious about what they're going to do with us or depressed because we're tired of them. And then we go, okay, now I'm training my mind and heart. Now I'm becoming spirit in the sense that I feel coherence and the kind of field of consciousness as a part of being that doesn't have to have a self. And now we're actually training the way a martial artist, a Qigong teacher, a meditation practitioner, I don't know much about yoga, but I assume it would be similar for yoga, many shamanic traditions. They ask us to change they ask us to change what it's like to be a being. And you can't do that without training. But most of us at first have to just become okay with ourselves to move beyond ourselves.
Yeah.
And that transition is becoming an adult, becoming a part of a community, going through an initiation, a rite of passage. And then you know you have a whole self, and then you can let it go.
This is really good. This is really good. Yeah. So, because if you were to skip that part about accepting yourself or coming to terms with who you are, then you would just be dismissing yourself. And I think that's big part of my healing anyway. And when I'm working with clients, is that discovering unconscious parts of me who's dismissing me, who's rejecting some kind of emotion. And I think for the wound in the stomach and other symptoms can be due to that, even though in my mind I'm like, no, that's okay, I'm completely in acceptance of it. Then when I dive deep into myself, then I find parts that is rejecting it and that is saying, oh, she's a crazy person, like judging the symptom, judging that part of me who's signaling a need for help actually.
Hmm.
And
And what would be the opposite of that?
yeah, well, it would be
I
love.
mean, it's this the scary bad opposite. So let's say that negating yourself and your experience is one thing. Accepting and being allowed to feel what you feel is one thing. What would be way over here?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is love, loving it, loving.
How about a person who's so proud of themselves and wants everyone else to acknowledge themselves that they have nothing but a giant advertising department to promote themselves in the eyes of other people?
Are you saying that is a healing remedy?
No, I'm saying that's what the other crazy is. We all go kind of off our well-being in one direction and off our well-being in another direction. So if, negating self is one thing, over promoting yourself is not okay either. It's always going to be somewhere in the middle of the two ways and there's more than two, there could be many. I'm just bringing that up as a way for all of us to go, right.
Oh,
Bouncing back and forth between the extremes isn't really a path, it's just a reaction or a compensation. And addiction is just compensation. So if we want to come to truth, well, we have to begin with pain. We have to begin with, I'm holding on to a self that's in pain. Can I
mm.
cultivate awareness, mind capacity, heart capacity, adaptive capacity, physiological capacity, patience, good sleep, good food, enough to actually carry that pain in a sacred and meaningful way to heal and become whole. And that might take a couple of years. But now I'm aware that I'm on a path, and the path is about finding that just nice sweet spot between this and that. And then as I move through life, if I start to go towards self-negating behaviors, I can be once again going, oh, the shaming and shunning. Now I'm doing that to myself. I'm actually putting myself down. Oh, I should learn from that. I'm going to go back into my practices and call my therapist and reorient myself, go to ceremony, stay up all night singing, maybe fast for a while, go through a rite of passage. Oh, yes, I am a whole being. But the opposite would not be okay. I'm going to start a cult. That'll make me feel good about myself. Now everyone just pays attention to me. Well, I'm stuck being that person for the rest of my life because I've promoted a self instead of a soul.
I really recognize that as well. Yeah. As
Oh,
so you're saying, would you call that a compensation, or I mean, it's a polarization for sure because it's like the opposite, and it's really coming from a good place. Like you want to get away from rejecting yourself. Then you're like,
yeah.
yes, completely. Just look at me, and I'm the greatest. But then it's not authentic, right? It's not. You don't have all of yourself on board with that.
Yeah, and you don't want to rely on yourself. Yourself is an abstraction.
Yeah.
You want to be aware that a self is something we use as selfing within our social awareness of being a person.
Yeah.
But when you're in practice, when you're alone, when you're cultivating your actual authenticity as being. The self is something that you actually, at a certain point, need to put on a shelf, like next to your photo album and next to your phone and next to your resume and next to your bank account or your favorite thing you inherited from your grandmother, and go, that's all very lovely, but none of that's permanent, and none of that actually has to do with being a conscious, aware, empathic, intuitive, present, interactive being. It has to do with things I can say when I get bored or scared or insecure. So that's good to have that in your pocket, like it's good to have some money in your pocket. But outside of the interactive potential of mediating social encounters, a self is just something we kind of like are carving and molding like clay and coming up with a good one. But we also, especially at a certain point in meditation, realize that isn't what I'm here to actually attend to as my whole being. Because a being isn't selfing, a being is being. Selfing is something we do to get something right, compensate for what we feel is wrong. This is a First Nations thing or a Native thing. If you approach life as if there's something wrong, then you're going to be compelled and obsessed with what's right. But you're also telling the universe that it's wrong. There's something wrong in the universe. Creation is creationing wrong. What do you do in a universe that's got something wrong with it? Well, you can't trust the universe now because there's something wrong with it, because there's something wrong with you, right? That's in itself an insane place to be, in the sense that it would make us more and more fragile about our adaptive capacity, our sense of what's really happening. So when we actually acknowledge the universe is doing exactly what she needs to do in her creationing, and my selfing is something that she needs me to do so that I can actually grow and mature as a social, reliable, collaborative part of a community, great. But that's got nothing to do with beingness, right? Because the compulsion is to get beingness right, which implies that there's something potentially wrong, right? Instead of, oh, I'm going to learn from this in this way. And at some point, this is another thing we say in ceremony, in First Nations tradition. All healing begins with grieving and ends in gratitude. Grieving doesn't mean sadness. Grieving doesn't mean loss. Grieving means the agony and anguish of all emotional overwhelm at the same moment. I am in grieving. I'm in melancholy. I'm in overwhelm. I want to yell. I want to cry. I want to be silent forever. I want to scream forever. I want to sing forever. I want to be in ceremony. I want because we're in the grieving process, and it's animistic and it's clawing, like it's kind of moving around. I'm watching you move around. Like grieving is something we do like animistically, somatically, almost out of control, to face the overwhelm with an overwhelming need to be whole, to do what you're doing right now. And if we can't do that, then we go into shock, we dissociate, we disappear. So Qingdribing is focused mostly on how do we help people grieve while keeping them from going into shock, given their state, their story, and the paradigm they're most comfortable working in.
Oh my gosh. Watching the clock. This is so good, Dr. Michael Smith. I'm really happy for everything you're saying, and happy that that you that you can associate so much from what I'm throwing at you. I really recommend people to also listen to your podcast, Primordial Tao, because this is where I also got the idea from about the stomach wound, the wound at the belly, because I don't know completely because I'm still like trying to get into your philosophy, right? But you do talk a lot about that. We were just mentioning here the animistic part of us, the animal, and that not to have the healing sound from Qigong being too nice, sober, but just like, go into that animal state in a way. And so I've been working with that as well, inspired by what you've said, to give sound to that feeling in the lower belly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The healing sound used to be a lot more shamanic than it is now.
Oh man. So I hope I get to meet you again, because this was I said earlier I was holding two things, and the other thing I had to let go of it because we ran out of time. But it's you talk about
We could do a part two if you want. I just have a class in a couple of minutes, but if
yes,
you want to schedule a part two, we could do that.
wonderful, because that's just the 6 ways that we can feel overwhelmed. And you have something on that on your website, so that would be interesting to go into. But
Yeah, that would be a important thing.
given us so much, I really appreciate it, and I appreciate you. So
It's
thank
lovely to meet you too, and I'm grateful to have this chance to chat.